The spinal cord, as such being a continuation from the medulla oblongata, is covered by three meningeal layers: the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. The space between the dura mater and the arachnoid is called the subdural space. The space between the arachnoid and the pia mater is called the subarachnoid space, and it consists of the CSF. Since the spinal cord terminates at the lower border of L1 vertebra as the conus medullaris, it is much safer to perform certain procedures which require deep incision towards the subarachnoid space below the L1 vertebra, that is from L2 onwards. Such procedures are called lumbar puncture or spinal tap. The space beyond the dura mater is the epidural space, which is used for pain management, mostly during Braxton Hicks or labored contractures. There are certain modifications of the pia mater involving 21 pairs of extensions along the length of the spinal cord between spinal segments reaching the arachnoid and dura, sometimes the vertebra even. They are called the ligamentum denticulata and helps in supporting the spine during movements. Linea splendens, which extends the length in the anterior median fissure for supporting the cord. It is helpful to protect the cord during kyphosis, which is bound to occur due to progressive age and gravity. The subarachnoid pillars are present in few, which assists in cushioning alongside the CSF. The filum terminale pierces the meningeal layers, which stops at the S2 vertebra and extends till the dorsal process of the coccygeal bone. The grey matter is the intersection of cell bodies and forms an H shape. White matters are nerve fibers and tracts in the periphery for conduction of the impulse up and down the cord. The spinal cord extending through its length forms columns, the white column and the grey column. The grey column of the spinal cord can further be divided into three groups: the anterior grey column, the intermediate grey column, and the dorsal grey column. The anterior grey column is essentially motor in function and has three groups: the medial group, the central group, and the lateral group. The medial group contains two nuclei, the ventromedial and the posteromedial. The median group essentially controls the motor function of the axial skeleton, the ventral median group that of the thorax, and the posterior median group that of the abdomen. The central group essentially controls the motor activity of muscles like the diaphragm. Lastly, the lateral group of the anterior grey column consists of three nuclei: the anterior lateral nuclei, the posterior lateral nuclei, and the post-posterior lateral nuclei. The anterior lateral nuclei controls the motor activity of proximal limb. That of the posterior lateral column controls that of the intermediate limb, and the post-posterior column contains the motor activity for the distal limbs. The intermediate grey column is essentially not present in entire length of the spinal cord, but rather only in that supplying to the autonomic nervous system, that is starting from T1 to L2 and S2, S3 and S4. It involves two further nuclei, intermediolateral and intermediomedial. The dorsal grey column is essentially sensory and has four groups of nuclei: the posterior marginal, substantia gelatinosa, nucleus proprius, and dorsal nuclei of Clark's. After considering the anatomical positions of the grey column nuclei, there has to be certain functional regions in the grey column as well. This includes the lamina. The lamina extends from the number 1 to 10 expressed in Roman numerals, starting from the dorsal column to the anterior column, winding back to the central canal. The first four lamina are majorly in the relation with majority of the dorsal grey column. Fifth and sixth lamina are for proprioception, synapsing with the dorsal nuclei of Clark. The seventh is for intermediate. Eighth and ninth are for motor functions, and 10th, winding back that lamina, controls the central canal and the flow of the CSF. Collection of nerve fibers connecting two cell masses within the CNS are termed as tracts. Descending tracts are motor which escapes via the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Descending tracts might be divided into two types, pyramidal and extrapyramidal. Pyramidal tracts originate from the pyramidal mass in the motor area 4 and 6 in the cerebral cortex and runs as the lateral corticospinal and anterior corticospinal tracts. The lateral corticospinal tracts accounts for 80% of them and traverse through the thalamus, midbrain, pons, medulla, and at the lower level of medulla, they cross to mark the pyramidal decussation and runs in the lateral white column of the cord. The rest 20% forms the anterior and runs in the anterior white column. Most of them cross, but a few, that is 5% of all the pyramidal tracts, do not cross, and these supply the neck. Therefore, motor control of one side of the body is majorly controlled by the opposite half of the brain. The extrapyramidal tracts involves a rubrospinal, tectospinal, oliviospinal, vestibulospinal, and medial and lateral reticulospinal. The rubrospinal runs from the red nucleus and crosses at the tegmentum of the midbrain, forming the ventral tegmental decussation. Its function is to maintain the tone of the limb muscles. The tectospinal tract originates from the superior colliculi of the midbrain and crosses at the tegmentum to form the dorsal tegmental decussation. Actually, the superior and inferior colliculi of the midbrain form an aperture called the corpora quadri gemina. This corpora quadri gemina has an essential function to maintain the visual and auditory reflex with respect to the head and neck. For instance, if someone shouts your name, your ears will catch the sound and will transmit them to the inferior colliculi. Processing would occur in the cerebral cortex at the same time as a reflex. The superior colliculi would send out impulse signals towards the eyes and the head and neck muscles to look and search for that sound. The olivary spinal tract arises from the inferior olivary nucleus, which forms the olive in the medulla. It remains uncrossed throughout. The vestibulospinal tract arises from the lateral vestibular nucleus of the pontomedullary junction. It maintains the tone of limbs in extension and head and neck. Lastly, we have the lateral and medial reticulospinal tract. They arise from the reticular nucleus distributed in the brain stem, majorly in the pons, and finally the synapse with lamina 7. It has major tonic roles in the axial and appendicular skeleton. Ascending tracts have sensory function. The ascending tracts of the spinal cord involves the fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, lateral and anterior spinothalamic, and ventral and dorsal spinocerebellar. There are three major receptions, that is exteroreceptors, proprioceptors, and reflex sensations. The exteroreceptors are carried by the spinothalamic tract. The lateral spinothalamic tract carries pain and temperature sensation from dorsal root and synapses at the lamina 2 and 3 with substantia gelatinosa. It traverses upwards after spinal crossing through the lateral white column immediately through its entry. However, the anterior spinothalamic tract carries crude touch and pressure, itching sensation, etc. from the dorsal root to lamina 3 and 4. It ascends for two spinal segments to cross and runs in the lateral white column. Proprioception is by fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus in the dorsal column, which starts from the dorsal root ganglion and synapses with nucleus gracile and nucleus cuneatus in the medulla oblongata. So the sensory impulses are carried from the tissue towards the spinal cord and it enters via the dorsal root ganglion. From here, they are carried by fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus up to the nucleus gracile and cuneatus in the medulla oblongata. From here, they traverse as the medial lemniscus and cross. They enter the venterobasal complex of the thalamus. From here, they are relayed to the posterior cerebral gyrus in the brain, where appropriate motor responses are judged. Spinocerebellar tracts are majorly responsible for reflex sensation. The dorsal tract runs from the dorsal root ganglion and meets with the dorsal nucleus of Clark and runs up in the lateral white column to reach the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The ventral tract runs from dorsal root to lamina 5 and 6 and runs up along the lateral white column through the medulla and reaches the superior cerebellar peduncle.